Greetings from the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Little Flower in San Antonio, Texas. We thank you for joining us for the 9th and final day of our novena of reflections in preparation for the celebration of the Feast of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux on October 1st. We have been looking at various themes and elements of the little way of Saint Thérèse. And the theme with which we conclude is the same theme with which we began, that of confidence in God's merciful love. We saw how this confidence in God's faithful and merciful and personal love for her was the foundation for all of Saint Therese's little way of confidence and love. And it remains so up to the very end. But today, to conclude, I'd like to share, and we'll listen to some of words of Saint Thérèse herself, how her confidence in God, she persevered in this confidence in the midst of great suffering. In other words, it can be easy to have confidence in God's love for us when we're supported by a consolation, by almost a tangible sense of his nearness to us. But what about when these things are missing, are absent? We feel no support, external support for this confidence and this trust in God's merciful love. Well, this was Saint Therese's situation. Once she entered the monastery, it seemed that the consolation in doing the things of God left her. In other words, often when she was praying or doing these duties of everyday life, we might say she felt like she wasn't getting anything out of it, so to speak. And yet she continued to do it out of pure love for Jesus in order to please him, not to get something out of it for herself, but in order simply to please him by the purity and unselfishness of her actions. She used the image that Jesus was leading her as though through an underground tunnel, through a mountain. She didn't know where he was leading her, but she followed him day by day in trust. She also remained faithful to him in the midst of great physical suffering, of her tuberculosis, this painful illness that she was suffering. And then finally, she persevered in this confidence amidst what she called her great trial of faith. The Lord allowed her to be tempted against the faith. She had lived her life dreaming of heaven and longing for heaven. And all of a sudden, she says, it felt as if a wall had been constructed, reaching from the ground, all the way up to beyond the clouds, so that she couldn't even see or imagine that there was a heaven. And she suffered temptations to believe that there was no heaven, and that when she died, there awaited nothing for her but nothingness. This was the spirit of atheism of her time. She describes herself as sitting at the table of sinners, those who had no faith of God. She came to almost to understand them and to have compassion for the darkness in which they lived. And yet she said, even though the sun, in other words, God's love, was all covered by clouds, she persisted and persevered, supported by God's grace, in this confidence and faith in the existence of God and his goodness and his faithful love and the truth of his word and of his promises. During this period of her trial of faith, Thérèse wrote beautiful poems and inspiring poems. And when one of her sisters learned about all that she was suffering interiorly, she asked Thérèse, well, how can you be going through all that and still writing these beautiful poems? Saint Thérèse responded, I write what I want to believe. And so, she persevered. She just almost willed herself to continue to believe and to trust in God's goodness and love and presence, and in the truth of his word and of his promises. All this, of course, supported by the grace of God. All is a way of being united with Jesus in his suffering and his sense of abandonment on the cross. And in addition to this, we might say, well, it would be easy for St. Therese to continue to trust in God's love. I mean, she never really committed any grave sins. Of course, she doesn't have to doubt God's love for her. St. Therese responds to such objections at the very end, the conclusion of her story of a soul. She writes, "Yes, I feel it, even though I had on my conscience all the sins that can be committed. I would go, my heart broken with sorrow, and throw myself into Jesus' arms, for I know how much he loves the prodigal child who returns to him. It is not because God, in his anticipating mercy, has preserved my soul from mortal sin that I go to him with confidence and love. No, there is no one who could frighten me, for I know too well what to believe concerning his mercy and his love. I know that this whole multitude of sins would be lost in the twinkling of an eye, like a drop of water cast into a burning furnace." So she says, it's not just because I never committed mortal sin that I trust in God's goodness and love. She says, no, even if I had committed every sin possible, I'd still go to God with the same confidence, because her confidence was not founded in herself, but her confidence in God was rooted in God himself, in the truth of his goodness and of his infinitely merciful love. And so may St. Therese help us to be inspired by the same confidence in God's love in the midst of whatever trial or difficulty or darkness we experience in our lives. May she help us to hear Jesus' words, "Come to me, all you who labor and find life burdensome, and I will give you rest." May we always find our rest, like St. Therese did, in our confidence and faith in God's merciful love.